Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I speak with Andreas M. Antonopoulos, a technologist and serial entrepreneur who has become one of the most well-known and well-respected figures in Bitcoin. He is the author of Mastering Bitcoin, published by O'Reilly Media and considered by many to be the best technical guide to Bitcoin. As an engaging public speaker, teacher, and writer, Andreas makes complex subjects accessible and easy to understand. As an advisor, he helps startups recognize, evaluate, and navigate security and business risks. Andreas was one of the first to use the phrase "the Internet of Money" to describe Bitcoin and its potential impacts on humanity. As a Bitcoin entrepreneur, Andreas has founded a number of Bitcoin businesses and launched several community open source projects. He serves as an advisor to several Bitcoin and cryptocurrency companies. He is a widely published author of articles and blog posts on Bitcoin, is a permanent host of the popular Let's Talk Bitcoin podcast, and a frequent speaker at technology and security conferences worldwide. He is also the CTO of Third Key Solutions, which offers consulting and cryptographic key management solutions for companies using decentralized digital currencies. So with that, I bring you the one and only Andreas M. Antonopoulos. Welcome to the show, Andreas.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. It's really a pleasure.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And I usually ask my guests where they're joining us from, but I understand you like to keep your location undisclosed.
Yes, and it changes very often because I'm a digital nomad, so I don't really have a permanent location. And, right now I'm in Southeast Asia, but moving around a lot.
Yeah, fantastic. And I understand that you're a stand-up comedy fan, and you've even started to incorporate some stand-up into your keynotes.
I'm a huge fan of stand-up comedy. I wouldn't say I've incorporated stand-up into my keynotes, although I certainly learned a lot about timing and storytelling from stand-up and from watching a lot of stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
So yes, I do try to keep it entertaining, though.
Yeah, excellent. And you took some improv classes.
A long time ago, yes.
Right, excellent. Cool. So, Andreas, I'd like to start by getting your definition of the blockchain. As I've heard many variations, some good, some not so good. Some start off simple enough, but then they keep going and going and they turn out into some complex mess. So without putting too much pressure on, what's your definition of the blockchain for our audience?
Well, blockchain is one of the four foundational technologies of Bitcoin, which is a digital currency, the first one to incorporate the invention of a blockchain within its spectrum of technologies. A blockchain is a system of a cryptographically signed digital ledger. That means that it is kind of like a spreadsheet of transaction or a database of transactions, where blocks of transactions are linked together in a historical record in such a way that with a few of the other technologies, you can make a global version of the truth of who owns what or who has which asset, if you like, that can be synchronized between computers all around the world without any one of those computers being in charge or having any additional powers over everybody else. Yeah. So it allows you to have this participatory system where You can record the transactions that are happening by participants in a way that's neutral and fair, that resists censorship, that can't effectively be shut down, and that becomes over time immutable, such that it takes an enormous amount of energy to record the ledger, and then the longer further back in history you go, if you like, it takes increasing amounts of energy to change the past, such that beyond a few days you really can't change the past. There isn't enough energy in the world to marshal to do that. And so that's what it is. That's the broad description of a blockchain. Keep in mind, though, blockchain is a term that's been used in marketing this technology. Mm-hmm. And very often people use the term blockchain to mean things that are very, very different from the original blockchain. The original blockchain, the foundational technology behind Bitcoin, is a decentralized system based on a competitive, participatory market economics system of security that uses a proof of work algorithm. Again, this may sound like gibberish to many, but what it basically means is that it's a system where no one is in charge and it's spread around the world and there's no central location. Now, people often use the term blockchain to mean things that are highly centralized. So if a bank is running a blockchain and they're in control of who gets to record the transactions, well, then it's really a blockchain only as a marketing term. And there's a bit of confusion caused, and some of that confusion is deliberate marketing disinformation in order to pretend to be doing the blockchain.
Yeah, and I understand that's something you've called out in the past, where you say that the banks are effectively attempting to separate Bitcoin from its characteristics of openness, decentralization, borderlessness, and permissionless access. Whereas, you've coined the term the Internet of Money to refer to a decentralized approach, whereas what the banks are doing is effectively an intranet of money.
Yes, and I also use the term open public blockchain to discriminate between the various types. An open public blockchain, as you find in Bitcoin and Ethereum and many other open public blockchains that exist now, is one where no one is in control, where it's decentralized, to different extents, and where all of the innovation happens at the edges and there's no one running it effectively. Everybody participates in it. Yeah. That has some unique characteristics. As I mentioned, from that comes the borderless nature, the censorship resistance, the neutrality of the platform. Of course, if you centralize the system, then you lose all of that. And then it's really not that interesting anymore.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess on it not being all that interesting anymore and on centralizing the system, I mean, we've seen, particularly here in Australia, I know that at least two of the big four banks, the Australian Stock Exchange, they're all exploring their definition of blockchain by partnering with companies like Ripple. And on one hand, people are saying that blockchain may disrupt many of the core banking business models, while banks are looking at ways to leverage the technology themselves. And I mean, how do you see this playing out?
Well, every bank in the world is doing that now. So for the first few years, they ignored the technology and hoped it would go away. And then as they saw that this technology was not going away and was very appealing to a lot of technical companies, they started embracing co-opting and trying to essentially shift it into their business as usual model of centralized control. So every bank in the world is now exploring blockchain within quotes. But what they're trying to do is dilute the very principles that make it interesting in order to create systems that are centralized, controlled, that allow these banks to do censorship and that really don't address the primary issues that this technology is trying to solve. And the primary issues that this technology is trying to solve is that the centralized, identity-heavy, surveillance-heavy financial networks of today effectively leave billions of people out and leave billions more subject to criminal banks and oppressive dictatorial governments and currency controls and manipulation and rigged markets. And that system of central control is basically something that doesn't scale to solve the needs of an increasingly interconnected, globalized humanity. The whole point of the open blockchain is to remove these intermediaries. And by removing these intermediaries, create a financial system, not to replace the existing one, but to provide an alternative parallel financial system that is completely open, completely borderless, that doesn't require identity or credit checking, and where no one has the control to confiscate, seize, freeze, control currencies the way the financial system is built today. Obviously, that is extremely promising for the billions of people who don't have access to financial systems today for reasons mostly to do with politics and less to do with technology.
Yeah, and
but it's also extremely threatening to the companies that make trillions of dollars by controlling the flows of money.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you touched on quite a few points there on neutrality, corruption, particularly in the developing world. And obviously, you've got, I think it's between 2 and 3 billion people that are unbanked in the world. And oftentimes they can't afford the bank fees that come with, say, global remittances and everything else. Whereas with the blockchain, you can effectively take out, say, the 3 to 5 day settlement time and the fees that come along with it, and therefore empower the world's unbanked to become banked.
Yeah, and even those measures that you see, for example, the World Bank estimates there are 2.5 billion people who are unbanked.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's look at that number more accurately.
Mm-hmm.
They count the working age heads of household who have absolutely no banking capability whatsoever. That is probably the narrowest definition you can apply.
Yeah.
That means they don't count their spouses, their children. They don't count anyone under 18.
Mm-hmm.
They don't count people who have a very limited or restricted type of banking, like a basic checking account that only works in one currency, that has very heavy fees, that required a lot of identification, that doesn't allow people to transfer money to other countries or to change currencies, or that is subject to very heavy controls. So if you take the narrow measure, 2.5 billion people, if you add in their families and you look at kind of very restricted banking, you're easily up to about 4 billion people who are severely underbanked, right? Or completely unbanked.
Yeah.
And then you flip it on its head and you look at, well, you and I, Western privileged elites of finance, right? The middle class in any developed Western society has access to an enormously powerful range of financial services, deep liquidity pools, credit, the ability to open a brokerage account and be trading on the Tokyo stock market today with no effective restrictions on the amount of currency you can transmit, what currencies you can buy, which stock markets you can trade on. Very, very few restrictions, right? And you could do that online today with a brokerage account and be happily trading with the world. That kind of banking, that kind of power banking, if you like, privileged banking, if you like, really only about 1.5 billion people have. And that leaves the other 6 billion. And the other 6 billion have a second-class style of banking, which is basically a very expensive checking account that can't really do anything more than one currency and keeps them trapped in an economy where their corrupt government and the corrupt banks take advantage of them and effectively levy all of these fees that make them indentured slaves to this banking system. So, 2.5 billion, says the World Bank. 4 billion is the broader measure, and 6 billion is if you consider the fact that everybody on this planet should have the same access to banking that I do. And that's really the bigger vision, right? What happens when you give everybody the same power that a Swiss banker has on a $25 Android smartphone? the ability to initiate and receive international wire transfers in minutes in any amount without any restrictions worldwide, without even presenting ID. Now, if you can do that, the world changes dramatically. And that's the promise of open public blockchains. That's where we're heading. And of course, that is terrifying to those who want to create a closed and controlled financial system that benefits very, very few people by condemning 4 to 6 billion people to poverty or stagnation.
Yeah, and there's a lot in there, Andreas. And I guess on the blockchain effectively empowering people in the third world, you're talking 4.5 odd billion people by your measures, to access capital, to build their own businesses, to become more entrepreneurial, especially as Project Loon, Facebook's project to effectively bring Wi-Fi to the developing world, parts of Africa, and so on. Do you effectively see, I suppose, a new wave of entrepreneurship over the next, say, 10 to 15 years coming out of the developing world and effectively having a massive impact on, say, the power structures of the world?
Yeah, but you don't really need to consider this only from the perspective of entrepreneurship. I
Mm,
mean, just the basic idea of people being able to keep more of their money and have less of it
true.
whittled away by coercive and unfair fees. You know, your average remittance wire transfer that a itinerant worker or immigrant sends home overseas will cost them 9% on average, but the poorer the country, the more expensive the fee.
Hmm.
You know, 9% of the income of someone who's living at a subsistence level of poverty is a huge regressive tax that will keep them in poverty for a very, very long time. If you look at the international remittance market, for example, there's $550 billion being sent by immigrants to their families every single year.
Mm.
On that money, the wire transfer costs and fees translate into $175 billion of fees earned by or extorted by the wire transfer companies that enable these payments. $175 billion, by the way, is the same as the sum total of world foreign aid that is delivered to developing nations.
Wow.
So while the world's nations are delivering $175 billion into a trickle-down economics that doesn't reach the bottom, right?
Mm.
Through all of these aid programs and development loans and foreign direct investment, et cetera, the world's wire transfer companies are taking the same amount, $175 billion, from the poorest people in the world directly from their income in order to allow them to send money home. Now, what happens if you change that equation? What happens if these people get to keep $175 billion? And most of this money goes to women who are in developing nations who, as the World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations have shown in study after study after study, every dollar that's added to their income converts into more than $2 of growth and is directly invested in housing, sanitation, healthcare, education, clean water. That's an enormous impact
Mm.
on poverty.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is not, you don't have to give people money. You just
Mhm.
have to stop taking money from the poorest people in order to enrich the shareholders of Western Union and Wells Fargo and MoneyGram and all of these companies. And so that's really what these open blockchains are about. It's not about entrepreneurship. It's just helping poor people keep their own money.
Yeah, and there's quite a bit of good stuff in there. I mean, it is about the subtractive process rather than giving them more money. It's about not taking away from them. And earlier in the show, you mentioned $25 Android phones. And in a lot of these developing parts of the world, people have had to, say, walk for potentially several hours in some remote parts of Africa to their local Western Union to remit those payments from the global diaspora, which is often fraught with danger, but not only that, it's a massive investment in time to get some money and reinvest it. But today, with $25 Android phones, with mobile payments, with blockchain, you can effectively not only give people money, but also give them a lot of time back.
Absolutely. Yeah. And reduce the risk and danger
Mm.
that's involved in a lot of these transfers, and also remove the points of coercion and corruption that exist in between. Because, don't think that they simply walk up to a Western Union and go, "Hey, give me my money." Um, you know, often there's an element of bribery that gets added to every step of this process. So the end fees, the hidden fees, are even higher than
Yeah.
than what's shown officially.
Great point. Great point. And you did mention neutrality earlier, Andreas. I mean, what do you make of institutions who, I suppose, might try and centralize control over digital currencies, which is somewhat resonant with everything that's going on right now in the space of net neutrality?
Well, it's a very similar concept, really. Open public blockchains do not care one bit about the source and destination of transactions. They don't care about the gender, race, age, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, nationality, identity of the sender and recipient, not one bit. And that is in direct contradiction to the way the world financial system works, and causes some people intense discomfort and fear about what this might mean in the long term if you allow people to have control over their money and make it impossible to restrict international money flows. But that is exactly what this technology enables. Net neutrality on the internet allowed for the first time the mostly unfettered free flow of information across the globe, and the ability of the average person to be not just a consumer of information, but also a producer of information. Open public blockchains allow the mostly unfettered free flow of funds across the world, of value across the world through the Internet of Money, and also allow the end users of this technology, the participants of this technology, to not just be consumers of financial services, but also to be producers and participants of financial services at every level. They can not just have a bank account, they can be a banker, or effectively what comes after being a banker, because that's obsolete in many fashion. So, the net neutrality resonates very much as part of this, and it's part and parcel of this idea of having open public transfer of value across the world.
Yeah, and what you said there about, the blockchain doesn't care about where you're from, age, gender, creed, religion, all that sort of stuff, and effectively aligns quite closely with a conversation I had last week with Kevin Kelly of Wired magazine fame, who basically said that, trying to ban the inevitable, as he calls it, or ban emerging technology, backfires most of the time. And I guess China, we've seen that in China where they tried to ban Bitcoin, but today I think it's about 80% of Bitcoin is now being traded in Chinese yuan.
Well, yes, that's changed over time, but China did not end up banning Bitcoin. A lot of noise has been made about that because every time there's any news of any sort, people immediately tend to go for the most sensationalist headline, even if it's not true. So China has never banned Bitcoin,
Right.
and yet the headlines will tell you that it's banned Bitcoin eight or nine times already. China prohibited banks from keeping Bitcoin as an asset on their balance sheet, which is very different from banning
Right.
Bitcoin. It essentially prohibited the banks from speculating in Bitcoin, which is ironic because effectively what that's doing is preventing the banks from participating in this system. And in fact, we've seen that across the world. Most of the government regulation has made it impossible for the banks to adopt or engage with this emerging technology. They can only engage with a watered down, centralized, and controlled version of it, which lacks all of the interesting features. But they can never play directly in the open public blockchain. And the reason is that would violate almost all of the regulations that they face as banks, which is fantastic. They've very effectively imprisoned banks within the golden cage of regulations that kept competition out for the last 50 years. And now banks find themselves sitting inside that golden cage looking out at a world where their latest competitor can't be sued, bought, blackmailed, or regulated out of existence, and yet they can't even use it because of the golden cage they've built.
And on that golden cage, I mean, prophetizing and looking into the future, say 20 or 30 years, I mean, what do you see as the role of today's banks, say 20 or 30 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, I think prophecies beyond 6 months are in this particular area of emerging technology are more or less wild
Redundant.
ass guesses,
Hmm.
and even at 6 months out, you know it's almost impossible to predict the timescale of how these things develop because these are essentially level two chaotic systems. They're not just systems that represent, you know, the concept of chaos, where small changes in the initial variables cause massive changes in the outcomes.
Mm.
But you know, as level two chaotic systems, they have feedback loops where the system is constantly changing because of human behavior and interactions on a greater scale. You've got to consider that what happens to banks is not solely dependent on this emerging technology, which is certainly disrupting them from below. It's also the fact that the international monetary system goes through these very long cycles that last, you know, 30 to 100 years, um, where they have to redesign everything because it blows up in their face. You know, the last great redesign was in the 1970s when central banking was fully untethered from any issuance of debt against gold. The previous great redesign was in the 1930s when central banking where the currencies themselves were untethered from gold. Both of those backfired spectacularly in many countries, and today we're seeing probably a global unraveling of the third age of central banking. You know, central banks are in deep shit.
Hmm.
They have printed themselves into a level of debt that is now more than 300% the annual global GDP. If you have a credit card and your credit card debt is three times your salary, there's a word for that: insolvent.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep.
And basically, we're now seeing this on a global scale. Almost every government in the world is facing crushing debt that there's no way to get out of other than massively debasing the currency by printing so much of it that it becomes worthless, and therefore the debts can be repaid because they're being repaid in worthless money. You know, that's basically the bargain. And so, how does the world banking environment change over the next 30 years? Well, you know, nothing much happens, and then everything happens at once
Mm.
because you have a cascade failure of the system. Unfortunately, the last time you had a cascade failure of the system, it led directly to the Weimar Republic's great hyperinflation event. Basically, if you look at the history, it's very interesting. The German government, after the Treaty of Versailles from World War One, faced this catastrophic amount of debt that they couldn't repay. So they started printing. They started printing gold marks, and they were printing these marks. It was supposed to be backed by gold, but they weren't, and they kept printing and printing and printing and printing, and until it took 1 trillion marks to pay for a cup of coffee, and people in Germany were carrying around wheelbarrows full of money. That led directly to the Second World War, the collapse of the economy in Germany, the ascendancy of extremists, and Adolf Hitler coming to power. So the previous great banking experiment uh, led to a world war. Hopefully, this one won't. But you know, disrupting the monetary system is not something to be taken lightly. Yet we're now in an environment where the greatest monetary experiment of all times, certainly of the last century, is taking place, and most people are oblivious to it.
Mm. Yeah, and
How are how are banks going to change? I can't even predict that out a year. Who knows?
yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess with artificial intelligence coming into play as well, you know, we are probably not even biologically in a place where we can anticipate what those changes will look like because they may just move much faster than what we're capable of even responding to in any meaningful way. Um,
Well, one thing we can see,
mhm.
and that is that we're still operating the world financial system based on a model that emerged in the Industrial Revolution, which is that of the hierarchical organization, the bureaucracy, a pyramid-shaped organization where you have highly centralized power at the top, funneling down decisions that get distributed from headquarters to the branch offices, from the branch offices to the managers, from the managers making loan decisions, et cetera, and trickling back up the pyramid, which gives enormous power to those who are at the top of the pyramid, the central bankers, the CEOs, the heads of corporation, the global leaders, et cetera. That model is failing to scale. It's failing to scale to solve the needs of a globalized humanity. And there's now a new model in town. And that model is a network-centric, flat organization, peer-to-peer, participatory systems, crowd sale, crowd source, crowd fund, crowd think. The internet revolution, really. And that's giving us new glimpses into organizing society in a much more equitable and flat system without so many rulers and leaders, and with more participants on a global basis operating on an equal basis. But what happens if you add money to that mix? And so, the real issue here is that the primary organizational model for society is failing to scale, and we now have a new way to organize social institutions. Blockchain is that. It's the application of that new model of networks plus markets applied to finance.
Yeah, and on our crowdsourced organizations, Andreas, is that effectively, I suppose it aligns with the DAO, the Distributed Autonomous Organization? Is that what you're referring to there, or is that just one instance of what a crowdsourced organization might look like?
That's just one instance of what it might look like. There will be many, and we're still in a very early experimental level of that. So, expect to see a lot of glitches and failures. But the model is to flatten governance and create governance using networks and markets rather than hierarchies and institutions.
Yeah. And on I mentioned the DAO just a second ago, but obviously there was the $50 million theft last year from the DAO. I guess what are some of the risks in the short term? And I guess, based on what we've just been talking about, potentially there's a lot more risks that we're not aware of yet. And how do you see us navigating that? Is that just part and parcel with any new technology? There's going to be good, there's going to be evil, and we just need to find a way to mitigate those risks and respond in an effective way. Just keen to understand your thoughts on the cybersecurity risks.
Yeah, there's lots of risks, obviously. This is highly experimental stuff. It's very fast moving. And, the primary approach to this should be caveat emptor, buyer beware. You should not be throwing your money into untested technologies and hoping it all goes well. Of course, the risks in this new technology are minuscule compared to the massive systemic risks that exist in the global financial system, many of which are almost invisible. But still, this is experimental technology, and as it grows, we're going to see both maturity increasing, but we're also going to see the scale of failure increasing. And, failure is part of and an important prerequisite to success. You can't have success without the possibility of failure and without risk. And, especially with new technologies, you are going to see some pretty spectacular crashes and some pretty spectacular failures. Of course, with that comes the possibility that some of these will be very successful and will be the next great success. Whether that's a company that solves a very big problem or a new model for organizing things that becomes extremely successful and widespread. And so that's part of the experiment. A lot of people look at this and their initial reaction is, we need to regulate this. And what they mean by we need to regulate this is we need to impose an institutional, hierarchical, organizational, bureaucratic oversight mechanism on top of this new network. That's the wrong answer. That's recreating the problems of the past. regulation does not effectively protect consumers. And anyone who watched the 2008 crisis unfold knows that now. Um, and if you don't know that, you live in a world of delusion. But when the only crook who went to jail was Bernie Madoff because he stole money from the rich. That's the one mistake you don't make in that game, right? You can steal from the poor all day long, but God help you if you steal from the rich. That's the only banker who went to jail effectively, and a couple of low-level stooges here and there, and everybody else got a bailout and a bonus. Um, that's how our regulatory system responded to the greatest, most catastrophic con game that had played out over more than a decade and enriched all of these people. And in the end, all of the profits were privatized and all of the losses were socialized, shared by the taxpayers. That's not how capitalism is supposed to work. That represented a fundamental failure of regulation. So the idea that we should take that model and apply it to this new technology is laughable. The model doesn't work. It doesn't work at that scale. It's not going to work at this scale, and certainly can't keep up with the speed of development of this technology.
Yeah.
Instead, we should really think about what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve consumer protection. How can we do that with programmable money on the Internet of Money? Well, a lot of new ways is how we can do it. So we can actually disrupt regulation itself by implementing technological solutions that achieve the same goals, that allow us to reduce risk, increase transparency, and protect consumers without putting a bureaucracy on top.
Yeah, and what you said there aligns with a conversation I had with Alex Tapscott, who wrote The Blockchain Revolution, where he was saying that, the global financial system is so complex right now that government can't respond in any meaningful way, which effectively led to the 2008 global financial crisis.
Well, I mean, yes, that's one part of it, but the other part of it is capture. It's regulatory capture, and it's important to really recognize that and stare at it hard in the face because that's a reality we have to understand. And the fact is that the regulators are thoroughly captured by the industries they're regulating. Yeah. Regulatory capture means that the interests of the regulators are aligned with the success of the industry. And that means that what's good for Wall Street is good for America. That attitude that exists among regulators, that Wall Street is the economy and needs to be protected from itself, and that the regulators effectively end up working for Wall Street rather than the other way around. And eventually the government works for them too. So the idea that governments can't keep up with the complexity of the financial system is a bit of a smokescreen. It's kind of giving excuse. Their job is to protect the public from rampant excess that occurs in those industries. And it's not just that they can't; it's that they don't. The motivations and incentives are misaligned.
Earlier in our conversation, Andreas, you mentioned how the technology is quite experimental, still in its embryonic stages. It is subject to glitches and crashes. I mean, we've seen Mt. Gox a couple of years ago now. We've seen the price fluctuations more recently. And on price fluctuations, I know Bill Gates has gone on record as saying that his foundation doesn't use Bitcoin because he says, and I quote, "The poor shouldn't have a currency whose value goes up and down a lot compared to their local currency. If a mistake is made in who you pay, then you need to be able to reverse it, so the anonymous nature of Bitcoin wouldn't work." What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to recognize which aspects of money we are looking at when we talk about money. So there's three different aspects of money. There's medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account. So medium of exchange is when you use the money as a token in order to purchase products and services. Store of value is when you use money in order to save, in order to protect your savings and hold your savings. And unit of account is the money used in order to price things. It's the independent universal value measure, a metric. Now, Bitcoin and the other open blockchains are currently best suited for store of value applications. They're kind of okay for some large cross-border style medium of exchange applications because the price is still quite volatile, the liquidity is limited, the overall volume of the space is quite small, which makes the system more volatile. And they are currently thoroughly unsuited towards unit of account because you don't price things in a volatile currency. Now, volatility has been going down every year for the past 8 years since Bitcoin started in 2009. And as it gets bigger, it gets less and less volatile. So that's really just a matter of scale and time. It's like Bill Gates saying in 1991, well, we can't use the internet to do Netflix-style video to the consumer. Yes, sir, you cannot yet. But that's not an inherent limitation of the system. That is simply a matter of maturity and which part of the maturity curve you're on at the moment.
Yep.
The other idea that if you make a mistake on the recipient, you can't reverse a transaction, and that anonymity is a problem, I think represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what Bitcoin is as a protocol and what other blockchains do. There are plenty of reversible systems, and in fact, it's very easy to simulate a reversible transaction on top of an irreversible ledger. What is irreversible in Bitcoin is the transaction contract, the script that you're running, which is defined in a programming language. And whatever you write in that program will be executed exactly as is. So if in your program you write, I give 1 Bitcoin to this seller for their product, yes, that's irrevocable. That's an irrevocable payment. But if in your program you write, I lock 1 Bitcoin for 30 days, and unless there is a dispute in which this third party gives me a refund, then the seller gets the money. That's the program that's going to be irreversible and guaranteed by the blockchain. So as you can see, it's very easy to make a refund, an escrow, or another feature programmed in this programmable money. And the beauty of it is that whatever program you write will be executed without fail, without reversal, without censorship, without anyone having control. That is the fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of this. It's not the payment that's irreversible, it's the program. And if that program is simply, hey, pay the seller, yeah, then you might have a problem with consumer protection. But that's not the only program you can write. And it's important to realize what the benefit of this is, because every other financial system that has reversible payments, the problem is it can't actually guarantee that a payment will happen. It's impossible to guarantee. It is subject to the discretion of a centralized financial industry or organization. And so in order to get this idea that consumers can get recourse and refunds, what we do is we give this enormous power to centralized financial institutions to decide who and when gets the refund. Of course, it really depends who benefits from the refund, because if it's the bank that made a mistake and they benefited, good luck getting a refund.
Yeah.
You'll soon find out that rule doesn't work. And so that's not consumer protection. That's consumer protection at the whim of centralized institutions that will put profit first every single time and screw the consumer. With a programmable neutral platform like Bitcoin, you get this guarantee that whatever you write in that contract will get executed. That's an enormously powerful thing. It's a guarantee that no other financial system can provide. And on top of that, you can soften that guarantee if you want. But what you can't do is take something that's a soft, discretionary, profit-driven system and add a hard guarantee. That's impossible. So I'd rather start with a hard guarantee and work backwards. Again, this technology is new, and a lot of people really don't understand how it works. In this particular case, Bill Gates doesn't understand how it works. I think really seeing what it is today and missing what the vision is and where the roadmap is taking us on this technology is a fundamental problem with any new emerging technology. When people looked at the internet in the early days,
Mhm.
they couldn't see the potential of where it was going. It's impossible to see into the future. If you looked at cell phones in the 1990s, right? What were cell phones? Cell phones were a device that you install in your car if you are a rich CEO. I don't think anybody at that time could foresee a time when a Kenyan farmer in the middle of nowhere has a solar powered cell phone that costs less than $10 to purchase. And that in fact the new status symbol for a CEO is that they don't carry a cell phone; they have an assistant who answers calls for them.
Yeah, and I mean, when you talk about cell phones in the 90s or even going back to the 80s, the first image that comes to mind is of Michael Douglas in a robe in the middle of the beach in Wall Street.
Yes, with a suitcase size thing.
Yeah.
That cost thousands of dollars, and even cost more than several $100s just to operate on a monthly basis.
Mm,
Of course, yes, that cell phone would never change the world, but that's not the cell phone we ended up with.
yeah.
And this Bitcoin we have today is not what we're going to end up with. This is the early prototype, and the early prototype obviously still doesn't have the characteristics of scale, cost, and economies that are going to emerge. But it's important to recognize that, like any emerging technology, Bitcoin sits on an exponential curve.
Mhm.
Exponential curve of innovation, exponential curve in terms of economies of scale, exponential curve in terms of rate of change and rate of adoption. And exponential curves are really tricky. Humans can't easily comprehend how quickly you go from something that looks like it's not moving at all and is mostly horizontal to hitting the elbow of the curve, as it's called, and then it looks almost vertical. That very sudden transformation. Exponential curves have this characteristic where for a long time nothing seems to be happening, and
Mhm.
then everything happens all at once. That's how cell phones rolled out,
Yeah.
right? That's how the internet rolled out. You have this tipping point. So don't underestimate an exponential curve. Right now, we're having these discussions. It's like, can we achieve the scale of Visa? And the funny thing is that if you look at that from the perspective of Visa, it's like, well, it took us 100 years to get to this scale of international payments, and Bitcoin is here, therefore it will take them 100 years to catch up.
Yeah.
That's not how it works on an exponential curve. The
Yeah.
thing is that the day we achieve Visa scale on the Bitcoin network will be 6 months before we achieve 10 times Visa scale. And 6 months after that, we'll be doing 100 times Visa scale because we're on a completely different rate of development.
Yeah, and I think to put that into perspective, when you talk about that exponential growth, I mean, if you look at the amount of transistors we added to a microchip in the past 5 years, it's something like 100 times more than what we did in the entire decade of the 90s, because we are at that sort of inflection point, as you were saying, where over time you don't really notice a difference, but you get to a certain point where it's just straight up through the roof.
Yes, well, it's also similar, I think, in the early days when people were looking at the internet, they were talking about, well, how many of the world's phone calls can this technology displace?
Hmm.
Now, obviously, the really interesting thing today is that if you talk to anybody under 30, they don't do phone calls at all. I mean, they simply don't. You can't get most people under 30 to pick up a phone and talk to you. Um, so it's completely changed the model. It's not about replacing phone calls. It's about using every other means of communication instead. But the interesting thing was that at first the internet could not do even a fraction of a fraction of the world's phone calls. And then one day it could.
Hmm.
And then today, 98% of all long distance international calls are carried over the internet. And not just that, but now the internet can do all of the world's calls in HD simultaneously and can also do video calls. So it's a whole order of magnitude greater. And that happened very quickly.
Yeah.
And people didn't really anticipate that rate of change. The same thing is going to happen with this technology. Decentralized architecture for payments means that eventually the cost per unit, per transaction will drop so dramatically that it will absolutely be suitable for people with very low income to use this technology. And it will be very empowering for them because they will not only be able to do a transaction at very low cost, but that transaction will be near instantaneous. It will be global. It will be completely outside the control of anyone, and they won't even have to show ID, which many don't have, in order to join the system. And that's really transformational.
Yeah, and there's a lot of points there that I wanted to explore, but I guess on the topic of 90% plus of the world's long distance phone calls being made via the internet, I mean, this podcast is, I guess, a reflection of that. I mean, you're somewhere in Southeast Asia right now. I'm in Melbourne, Australia. We're having this conversation, but not only that, we're going to publish this conversation, and it's going to go it's going to be distributed to every corner of the globe. Anyone with an internet connection will be able to listen to this, and we get something like 100,000 listeners a month. And that not only disrupts what the telecommunications companies were doing, but also media distribution, marketing. It's just leveling the playing field for everyone. And what you're talking about with blockchain is that it effectively lowers the playing field when it comes to not only accessing financial services, but becoming a producer or a banker, as you said earlier. But that just takes time to get to that sort of inflection point and to distribute those benefits.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember the history of this technology too. We're using Skype at the moment, but I think it's important to remember that when Skype first came out, it was absolutely illegal in the vast majority of countries around the world. And the world's telecommunications providers worked very, very hard to try to ban it, to disconnect internet connections that use it, to try to firewall it and block it, because it would directly disrupt their ability to earn fees through long-distance calls. They called on the world governments to regulate this technology. And Skype didn't succeed because it asked for permission. Skype succeeded because it didn't ask for permission, because what it did is it established facts on the ground faster than the regulators could make them illegal. And it changed the world faster than the law could catch up with. And most great technologies do that. It's important to remember that, because Bitcoin is not going to succeed, and the other open blockchains are not going to succeed by asking for permission and waiting for a legal authorization by the world's governments that are bought and sold by, the world's governments are bought and owned by the world's banks. They're not going to give permission to disrupt their primary constituency, which is giant rich corporations. So the trick here is to not ask for permission. The trick here is to put this technology in as many hands as possible, empower people, give them solutions that allow them to change their lives and to protect themselves from centralized institutions, and create facts on the ground faster than the law can adapt. And that's the only way it's going to happen. It's important to remember that, because people think, the only way this will succeed is if we play fair and play nice with the banking system, if they give us permission, if they integrate us into their system. That's not going to happen. We're going to build a completely parallel system, and it's going to succeed only because people use it and refuse to stop using it when they're told they should.
Yeah. And I guess when people say, if the banks let us play, if we play nice, the banks will let us use it. And I mean, that's a very short-term sort of view of the world. I mean, the modern banking system as we know it goes back, to, say, the start of the 20th century. But the globe has been spinning for 2.5 billion years. Mankind in its current form has been walking the globe for tens of thousands of years. So to look at the world and say, oh, well, if the banks let us play nice. But what you're saying is the current power structures, current social hierarchies, everything will effectively change, and maybe and we touched on this earlier where you said we can't really effectively predict more than 6 months out, let alone 30 years out, but the way the world financial system effectively looks could be fundamentally different years from now, to the point where the banks don't have that concentration of power.
Yeah, there is nothing to say that the system that we have today is either the best system, or that it has to be this way, or this is the only way things can be done. That's the illusion of permanence that every society has. Right? You're born into a world and you assume it's more or less always been this way, or it's already at the pinnacle of development and it will always be this way. And that's the biggest illusion that exists because nothing could be further from the truth. The current banking system is an experiment. It's a short-lived experiment. It's not actually working so well, especially if you take the broader measure of how many people it serves and who it serves. And so from that perspective, there's a lot of people who simply refuse to accept that, refuse to accept the status quo and say, you know what? Maybe we can do better. Maybe we can do different. Maybe we can empower others. Maybe we can serve people in a different way. And you know, that's what these systems represent. The open blockchain is an experiment to see if we can do things differently. No one has to adopt it. It's not forced on anyone. It's entirely opt-in. And, you know, let's see where it goes.
Yeah, yeah. And on that illusion of permanence, Kevin Kelly calls that the short now versus the long now. And he says stuff like, you know, in 2046, the old graybeards will say stuff like, oh, wow, wouldn't it have been awesome to build a business back in 2016 when everything was free reign, or when everything was open and VR hadn't really been exploited yet, and blockchain and artificial intelligence was still more or less in its infancy in terms of its commercial applications. But people are too focused on the near term, that permanent, or that illusion of permanence, as you said, rather than saying, hey, we're probably still at the embryonic stages, and what it is today and what it looks like in, say, 30 or 40 or 50 years from now is going to be completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very much also a generational game.
Yeah.
If you talk to people over, say, the age of 40, and you talk about replacing the banking system with a system based entirely on the internet, designed and executed by nerds, they find that idea quite terrifying, in fact. They think that the idea that you can have value in a currency without the blessing and authority of the government is impossible, or that you can have stability in a monetary system, which is ironic, right? They trust in institutions because those institutions have been present all of their adult lives.
Yeah.
You talk to anybody under 30, first of all, they don't believe in institutions anymore because in their lifetime, they've watched these institutions collapse and betray them during the 2008 crisis. And all of the esteemed institutions are basically failing to address the problems of a millennial generation. So they don't believe in any of that. They don't believe in career. They don't believe in government. They don't believe in banking. They don't believe in the church. They don't believe in the military. They don't believe in civil rights. They don't believe in any of these institutions because those institutions have failed to scale. And so then you tell them, how about we run our financial system on something built on the internet that's run by nerds? And to anyone under 30-year-olds, like, well, duh, obviously, of course.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we use the internet to run a global currency?
One thing you touched on earlier in the conversation, Andreas, was on anonymity and how people, not necessarily just in developing worlds, but how people can access funds, remittances, and so on, even without identification. And this is perhaps a concept that, say, your layman on the street will struggle to get their head around. So what does this anonymity look like, and how does it allow people to effectively have, say, that unit of control to store their cash, but be anonymous at the same time?
Well, let me ask you this. If someone brings food, delivers food to your apartment, right? Maybe you order food every now and then, and you hand them $5 in cash. Do you ask for ID?
No, I do not.
Okay. Do they ask you for ID?
Probably not.
Yeah, so neither party really cares who you are or who they are, and the interesting thing is that cash, as a financial instrument, is what's called a bearer instrument. That means that the value is transferred through the ownership of the instrument itself. If you hold it, it is yours, and it has that value regardless of context, regardless of who you are. Cash is not subject to any restrictions as to its value. If you hold a note, it is yours. You don't need all you need to do is verify that it's real, right? Bitcoin is a system of electronic cash. It's a bearer instrument, and that means that if I give you Bitcoin, you don't need to check who I am or whether I'm credit worthy or whether any of that. You just need to make sure the Bitcoin is real, and that's very easy to check with all the Bitcoin software verifies the accuracy. It's impossible to forge. Much, much more difficult than cash, in fact. And once you have it, you don't care who I am. I don't care who you are. It's just like cash. So people are already accustomed to a world in which people can pay people without identity anonymously by exchanging cash. In fact, the vast majority of the world's economy operates on cash. The difference is that we've gradually grown accustomed to this world of plastic cards. But plastic cards have this insidious way of making it impossible for people to pay people. If you've got a plastic card, you can pay a corporation that can pay a corporation that can pay a corporation that can pay a person. You've suddenly invited three corporations into this exchange who are each going to take a nice cut, but more importantly, who each can block, reverse, and limit that transaction based on who you're paying. So, this may not have happened to you yet, but if you try to pay certain organizations, you're quickly going to discover that you can't. Try paying WikiLeaks, for example, with a donation with a credit card. You'll find that's impossible. Even though they've never been convicted of any crime or been stopped by a judge, neither have you. You can't. So anonymity is this tricky thing. We have it with cash. We're losing it very rapidly as the world is moving away from cash, and yet it's the backbone of an economy based on community, based on people paying people directly without the involvement of corporate intermediaries. Yeah. What we're replacing this with is not just identity, but debt. The whole reason why you need identity with all of the other systems of payment is because they're not representing value as an instrument. They're representing debt. You're essentially owing money to someone, whether that's your credit card or your bank or whatever. And they're owing money to the next person who owes money to the next person. Of course, if you owe money, identity is quite important because you need to have a way to get paid back. And, usually that means taking someone's wages or their stuff if they don't pay. But when you're talking not about debt, but you're talking about a bearer instrument, an asset, something that has value in itself, identity is irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. And in fact, identity introduces a level of friction into transactions and a level of control by who controls that identity that is really detrimental to freedom and commerce.
No, that makes sense. I really like the way you I suppose, articulated that, Andreas. And earlier, we also touched on the concept of contracts of transactions or transaction contracts, and we talked about smart contracts. We touched on it. We kind of just skimmed around it. And one area where intermediaries or removing intermediaries may actually open up the playing field. For example, in Australia, 90% of people can't afford access to legal services except for the most basic thing. But smart contracts is one of those areas where we're effectively removing an intermediary. But the question I have is, what happens when a contract has a number of conditions, those conditions have been fulfilled, and therefore, say, money exchanges hands, but what if circumstances change during the delivery of that contract that warrants the money not being exchanged? What happens in that case?
Well, this goes to the heart of what it means to remove intermediaries. The important thing to understand is that what we're talking about is that intermediaries are not mandatory in these systems. They're entirely voluntary, meaning that you can write a smart contract that introduces an intermediary or a trusted third party if you want. It's just that you don't have to. Every other financial system that exists has counterparty risk and it has intermediaries, and those intermediaries are mandatory. If I'm doing a transaction on the Visa network or PayPal or whatever, I'm subject to the rules and conditions of Visa or the bank or PayPal. And that intermediary is mandatory. I cannot remove them from the equation. When I'm doing a transaction with a smart contract, I can make that smart contract have no intermediaries if I so wish to do. And for very simple things, in fact, it's beneficial. Like, for example, if I want to tip someone $5, I don't need an intermediary. I don't need a means for refund or recourse or chargeback. But if I'm buying a house, I need to do escrow. Or if I'm perhaps buying a car, maybe I don't trust that to a direct smart contract with no intermediaries. And here's the interesting thing, though. When I decide to add an intermediary to a smart contract, I can choose the intermediary. It's not a mandatory part, and it's not a fixed intermediary. So the buyer and seller can come to an agreement and say, I want to use PayPal as the intermediary. I want to use this lawyer as an intermediary. I want to use this real estate expert as an intermediary. I want to use this trusted person that we both trust as an intermediary. So suddenly it creates a whole new market for trusted intermediaries who may have some specialization. Maybe they're best at dealing with disputes in real estate or art sales or automobiles. And then you can use them. Why not? So you can introduce intermediaries if you want, but it's entirely voluntary, and you can work with, buyer and seller can work together to choose the intermediary that best suits their needs, or use no intermediary at all. There are ways to add arbitration and dispute resolution programmatically into these systems, and you can also add arbitration systems that have the weight of law behind them. There's an international convention called the New York Convention, which is a treatise that supersedes national law in 156 countries, I believe. It's what you'll see in your credit card contract. You know, you have an arbitration clause in there, or your cable service contract. You have an arbitration clause in there. Well, why not put an arbitration clause in a smart contract, and then we can have a process for resolving disputes that involves some third party, an arbitrator, a judge of our choosing, or an expert who can resolve commercial disputes, and you can embed that in the smart contract. There's no reason why not.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and effectively it comes down to the size, nature of the contract, but also personal choice.
Yes. Now, the big difference is that in most other financial systems, when you add an intermediary, such as an escrow agent or something like that, they physically take custody of the funds. And that introduces a very large risk, because the escrow party has exclusive control over those funds and effectively can run away with them, which is why you see a lot of oversight structures, such as custodial accounts and things like that, where you need a lot of oversight and a lot of organizational support to protect yourself from the risk of the third party taking away the money. Now, with multi-signature contracts that exist in open public blockchains, most or all of them, then you may have a situation where you say the buyer, the seller, and the escrow have 3 digital signatures. It will take 2 of 3 in order to disperse funds. That means that the escrow agent has 1 signature, which is not sufficient on its own to do anything. They never actually take custody of the funds. Escrow without custody is a very powerful concept, because it reduces the risk and therefore massively reduces the cost and the oversight needed of the escrow agent. They can only act if they combine forces with the buyer and the seller. And then there's a third really great benefit, and that is that the buyer and the seller, if they agree, which is 99.99% of all transactions without a dispute, they can sign without the escrow. So the escrow can do nothing. They can just sit back and watch the transaction go through. 99% of the time, they're not needed. They never take custody. They never have to apply a signature. They're there just for the 0.1% when there's a dispute. Now imagine how much that reduces the costs. For real estate transaction globally, you're looking at maybe 1 to 2% of the real estate transaction value goes to title and escrow. That's an enormous amount of money.
Huge amount of money.
Yes. And risk. And it's completely unnecessary. And so you can do some really interesting things once you understand this is programmable money. We can do better than before.
Definitely. Look, I've got a couple more areas I wanted to touch on before we wrap this up, Andrea. So thank you so much for being so giving with your time. One other area was on the estimated total power consumption of the Bitcoin network, which has been criticized. And again, like you said, this is an emerging technology. It will no doubt that will no doubt look different over coming years, but currently the estimates are that the Bitcoin network uses between 250 and 500 megawatts of power, and that this number will grow. And by 2020, some pundits are estimating that the Bitcoin network will demand as much energy as the country of Denmark. Is this sustainable? And if not, how do we navigate the energy challenges?
I think there's a couple of misunderstandings there. First of all, a lot of the articles you read about that talk about this being a waste of electricity. What it's actually doing is it's building a highly secure system. The energy used in Bitcoin provides the security of the system and makes sure that the ledger itself is immutable and cannot be modified by anyone, no matter how powerful and rich they might be. And the Bitcoin network is global in nature, so it has to be able to resist attacks by large global players, state actors, non-state actors, corporations, even alliances of large state and non-state actors who may be tempted to attack this. And from day one, even though it's not a very big network, it has to have global security. Yeah. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the amount of energy used does not scale to the number of transactions or participants, not at all. It's a completely independent metric that has to do with the incentives for security. With the level of security that it has today is sufficient to protect the network against very large state and non-state actors on a global basis. So if you just take this line and you say it will continue to grow and in 2020 it will consume the electricity of Denmark, that's making an assumption that it's going to continue to grow when in fact that's not necessarily the case. We don't know whether it will continue to grow like that. You can have the entire population of the planet using Bitcoin and its transactions with the same level of security that we have today, and it doesn't have to grow at all. Finally, the other thing is that the difference is that here, with a system like an open public blockchain, the amount of energy used to provide security is highly visible. It's measurable. It's a transparent public ledger. You can count exactly how much energy is being used. The global financial system is just take one subset of it, the payment industry, right? The amount of energy used for the headquarters and the lights and the data centers and the armored trucks and the diesel engines and the guards and the bars and the vaults and the giant data centers and risk and fraud management and all of the other intermediaries, that amount of energy is pretty staggering too. Yeah. But it's mostly hidden, right? It doesn't show up. That looks like, hey, positive economic activity. That's GDP.
Yeah, and it's about reframing how you look at it rather than just looking at that energy, like you said, as a cost. It's actually an investment in a better world and effectively helps 4.5 billion people become banked amongst many other applications and benefits that it will provide. So you should stop looking at it as a cost and rather look at it as an investment.
Well, if we were to replace a big part of the payments industry and all of their data centers and headquarters and lavish buildings and all of the power consumption they have with this system, then it might end up, in fact, being lower per transaction. The other really interesting thing is that the nature of Bitcoin mining and its profitability, because it can occur anywhere in the world, it tends to concentrate in areas where electricity is inexpensive or where the electricity being produced is mismatched with the demand for that electricity. So we're seeing an enormous investment in solar energy, hydroelectric, and wind energy for Bitcoin mining. And the reason is that those three types of energy often have very large mismatches between supply and demand. And that means it takes a very long time to pay off the capital cost of a factory. But if you use it to mine Bitcoin, you can pay off the capital cost much, much faster. So it ends up so that Bitcoin mining is actually subsidizing the rapid development of alternative energy.
Yeah, yeah, and that doesn't even account for. I mean, you mentioned the large financial institutions and all the costs that go into the buildings and the lighting and the vaults and everything else. But I remember reading an article which pointed out things like cat videos and the amount of energy that's consumed globally watching these cat videos. Which, if you jump onto YouTube, there's billions and billions of views, and it actually adds up to quite a bit of energy consumption for no apparent long-term gain or benefit to humanity. So it's an interesting one. It's all about the perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm. And lucky last, Andreas wanted to touch on. I guess there's a lot of people out there who have perhaps been swept up in the recent Bitcoin and Ethereum hysteria and picked up some currency for themselves. Of course, I'm not talking about myself, but do you have any advice on how they should best protect their Bitcoins?
Well, it depends on how much you have. First of all, I think it's inadvisable to invest a large amount of money into something that is experimental and volatile and
Yeah.
moves very, very fast, like a new technology like this. Just like I would say, in 1997, I would recommend against putting a significant chunk of your portfolio into internet stocks. You might be really lucky and pick Google, or you might be unlucky and pick Yahoo or Alta Vista. And then where are you? And the same thing applies here. It's useful as a diversification strategy to have a counter-correlated asset, maybe a small percentage of your portfolio, 2, 3, 4%. If you're a sophisticated investor and you understand what kind of risk that introduces into your portfolio. If you have a significant amount of Bitcoin, you should consider investing 30, 50, or $100 and buy a hardware wallet. This applies, if you have Bitcoin or Ether or any of the other major cryptocurrencies. Investing in a hardware wallet that can store multiple currencies, as many of them can, and using that to protect your investment. I think also another really important role, and we saw this with MT Gox and many other of the exchange failures. Uh, Open public blockchains introduce the idea that you can be in firm control of your funds, which comes with a fair bit of responsibility. If you take a digital currency and you store it on an exchange with somebody else having custodial control over it, that goes against everything that this technology was designed to do. And you're creating enormous risk because they have the keys, they control the keys, or the hacker that just hacked them controls the keys. And they've concentrated a very large amount of value in a centralized ownership of keys. That's dangerous. The whole point and the reason these systems are secure is because they decentralize the control, so there's no single point of failure. If you want to hack 1,000 people's Bitcoin, you have to hack 1,000 wallets that they each control. If those people put it all in one exchange, now you have to hack one exchange and you get 1,000 times the return. So, very important rule, which I use a slogan to express. If it's your keys, if you control the digital keys, it's your Bitcoin. Not your keys, not your Bitcoin. If it's on an exchange, it's not actually your cryptocurrency. It's a promise from the exchange. They owe you that cryptocurrency. You might get it, you might not. So I suggest that people trade when they trade on an exchange, and then they move their funds off the exchange, both their dollar, yen, euro, Australian dollar, as well as their Bitcoin, Ether, whatever, and move those onto something they control, like a hardware wallet. You can buy one for $30.
Yeah.
And that will make them a lot more secure.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think my mind has been blown enough for one day, Andreas. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this podcast a few times. But before we wrap up, it is customary to throw all of my guests into the ring for the 3-question lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll?
I am.
Let's do this. So, question number 1 is, if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company lifecycle in any era, so we could go back to the 19th century if we had to, who would it be and why?
Unfortunately, I am allergic to bosses. I am allergic to structure. And I have spent my entire career as a freelancer and entrepreneur, except for a brief period of about 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Since I was 15 years old, I haven't had a boss. And I'm very comfortable with that. So I work for myself, and I think I always would enjoy that more than
Yeah.
any other arrangement.
Well, that's a very fair answer, and I spent 10 years in the corporate world before striking out on my own, and I have to say it is one of the most liberating things you can do, particularly if that's the way you're wired. And
Hmm.
question number two, Andreas, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be, and what would you ask?
Oh, um, I might go back and ask some of the early philosophers and
Hmm.
thinkers from the previous century. Maybe I would be interested in asking someone like Adam Smith.
Hmm.
After I carefully explain to them what Bitcoin is, ask them what they think, and if they could ever envision a system like that from where they stand.
Yeah, you might have to explain Bitcoin a few times, I think, before they grasp it. Even someone like Adam Smith.
Probably.
And lucky last, Andreas, you obviously know a hell of a lot on the topic of Bitcoin or blockchain or cryptocurrencies. You're well traveled, quite influential in the space. I mean, aside from all the wonderful work you do in the space, I mean, what keeps you on top of your game? What keeps your brain firing because you've performed exceptionally well on this podcast. You've been gracious with your time. You've given us lots of insights. I mean, what do you do to take care of yourself to just keep on top of your game?
Well, apart from making sure that I take time off and workout and fitness and eating and all of the other things, and I'm one of my secrets is I take a nap every day,
Hmm.
um,
How long
and
for?
well, just about an hour in the afternoon
Hmm.
usually, and that gives me a second boost for the day. It's part of my culture, the siesta culture of the Mediterranean, really. But the other thing I would have to say, professionally, probably the biggest part of my life is reading.
Hmm.
I read nonstop, so both books, a very large number of books, as many as I can get my hands on, articles, etc. As an author, the only way to become a good author is to be a prolific reader, and that's one of the biggest things in my life.
Yeah, and what are you reading at the moment, Andreas?
I'm reading A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson, which is a fascinating look at the history of science. The unsung heroes who get lost in obscurity just because they didn't have a high enough profile, yet they actually invented the thing we think somebody else invented.
Hmm.
The quirky eccentrics, the crazy people, the people who everyone assumed was crazy, and in many cases they were crazy. It's kind of like the real history of science rather than the whitewashed version we get
Hmm.
through popular history.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating. It's hilarious too.
Fantastic. Well, that reminds me of Peter Diamandis' quote where he says, "The day before something was a breakthrough, it was a crazy idea."
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Andreas. You've been an awesome guest. This is probably the longest podcast episode we've done, so we're kind of moving into Joe Rogan territory here with the two hour episodes. But people can find out more about you. They can find out a little bit more about your work at Antonopoulos.com, and we'll put that in the show notes for those listeners who aren't too, say, well versed in the spelling of Greek surnames. They can find you on Twitter at AANTONOP, so that's AANTONOP. And you've also got a podcast called Let's Talk Bitcoin. Did you want to mention anything about your two books, Andreas?
Yeah, sure. I've published Mastering Bitcoin, which is a book for software engineers that explains how Bitcoin works. It's highly technical. It's published by O'Reilly Media. If you're a software engineer, great book to read. If you're not a software engineer, not great book to read. I've also published The Internet of Money, which is a collection of my seminars and talks, which is a passionate journey through the politics, economics, philosophy, and history of money as seen from the perspective of this new technology. The Internet of Money is about why Bitcoin matters, and it's for a general audience. It's for everybody else who doesn't quite get it yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm working on the second volume of that, as well as my next book, Mastering Ethereum, which is going to be a technical book about the smart contracts blockchain Ethereum.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Andreas. I think you have definitely earned yourself a afternoon siesta. I know it's only about 12 p.m. in Southeast Asia, but hey, I think you've earned it. So take an early nap, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. Hey guys, it's Steve again. If you're picking up what we're putting down, we'd love it if you took just a minute of your time to like, share, or subscribe to Future Squared on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. It would mean a hell of a lot to the team here who work effortlessly to bring you thought leaders and experts on topics of corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement on a weekly basis. As always, you can find more resources on innovation, including blogs, books, podcasts, videos, webinars, and tools at www.collectivecamp.us. If you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, you can do so at Steve Glaveski. That's Glaveski. Until next time, keep innovating. Future Squared out.